Hello, everyone, and welcome to Intentional Conversations. We are so thrilled to have you here today with our special guest for the day. Let us know as you're joining where you are in the world today. I know we've had a couple people drop their location already. We have Beatrice from London, UK, which is actually, the UK is where our guest is from. We have Maggie from New York City. Hello, Maggie. And we have Alabama. Yes, as you join, please let us know where in the world you are. We would love to hear throughout the conversation. If you have any questions as we're hearing from our guests, drop those in the stage and we will be sure to get to them at the end of the conversation. We'll give it just a moment to let some more people join the room. We have a couple people from Dallas, which is where our guest is actually from, or now lives in the Dallas area. But we will give it just a moment. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And so excited, no matter what time of day it is where you are, morning, afternoon, we're thrilled that you are on this conversation with us today. Well, I will go ahead. I know I said I'd give it a moment, but I'm just really eager and excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and bring us through just a couple of slides to let you know what we have coming up on our Intentional Conversations lineup. So next week, we have Starlet Farr joining us on May 7th, same time, same place, 11 a.m. Eastern here. Actually, we will get to this, but we are moving to Zoom starting next week. But Starlet will be joined with Christina Gardner, one of our DEI managers, and Nika, and they will be talking about her story of being a woman of color and first-generation college student while lending tips on how to begin making a difference. And so that's next week. And then the week after, we have Gamiel Yafai, who actually is in the UK, and we are going to discuss cultivating cultural intelligence and the intersectionality of different cultures. And so that will be on May 14th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And fun fact, I get my second dose of the COVID vaccine that afternoon. So it will be a very exciting day for me. And then, like I said, starting next week, we will be moving to Zoom. You will get more information via our weekly emails with that switch, but we look forward to seeing you all next week on Zoom. And as a heads up to anybody who's interested, we are actually hiring some new roles right now within the firm. And so if you're interested, visit our website, just nikawhite.com, to learn some more about the two roles that we have currently that we're looking for some people to fill. And then it's my great excitement to introduce you to our guest today. I will do his formal introduction with his bio, and then we'll have him join into the conversation. Our special guest for the day is the Reverend Dr. Neil G. Thomas, who is the senior pastor of Cathedral of Hope of Dallas, called and elected by the 4,500-member congregation on April 12, 2015, following a year-long search from the church. He began his tenure on June 3rd, 2015, and in 2015, he was granted privilege of call in the United Church of Christ. Prior to his arrival at Cathedral of Hope, Dr. Thomas served as senior pastor of two metropolitan community churches, MCC Bournemouth, England, and Founders Metropolitan Community Church, Los Angeles. The founding church of Metropolitan Community Churches, an international movement of churches reaching in and beyond the gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, and intersex community. A member of the Metropolitan Community Churches since 1981, Reverend Neil has served in numerous denominational positions, including chair, board of ordained ministries, member, elders task force on education, member of the European District Committee, member, board of Samaritan College in Europe, supervising pastor, and eusemenical, I may have butchered that word, officer. He has served on the moderator's advising team and consultant to the Office of Formation and Leadership Development. As a native of Bournemouth, England, Dr. Thomas was born into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His family left the Mormon Church in his early years. Dr. Thomas is a sought-after speaker, so we're thrilled to have him here today, and contributor to local, national, and international conversations around the intersectionality of faith, color, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And so with that, I am thrilled to introduce you, Neil. Say hello to our audience today. Welcome.
Well, good morning. And it really is a joy and a privilege to be with you and to share this time with you. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Yes. And so I love, we heard your full bio, but just tell us a little bit more about you before we jump into the conversation. Who is Neil? What we didn't see in your bio.
Well, I'm a dad. I'm someone who enjoys being with people. I'm a bit of an extrovert, which has made this time a little bit difficult, especially doing everything through Zoom and virtually, but found some good outlets to at least be able to do some of my extrovert stuff. I love to read. I love to keep up on current affairs, do a lot of advocacy work, but overall, at the end of the day, I like to pour myself a glass of wine and sit in the hot tub and look at the stars.
Great. Sit in the hot tub and look at the stars. Well, and I love that you led off with being a dad. I know we were talking about that before the conversation. Well, we will go ahead and dive in. And I'd love to start off first, if you could tell us a bit about Cathedral of Hope, the world's largest LGBTQ congregation.
So Cathedral of Hope here in Dallas is a member congregation of the United Church of Christ. It has been for just over a decade or so. Prior to that, it was a metropolitan community church, which gives the tie between where I landed first in my ordination track and where I am now. And Cathedral has always been a church on my radar, even when I was in Bournemouth, England. Reverend Michael Piazza, who was really one of the foundational pastors of that congregation, with Reverend Don Eastman prior to him, had really built a very strong congregation here. And it was an amazing congregation, watching it to grow, especially during the AIDS pandemic in the 80s here in the United States. The church became a beacon, and unusually so, because of course we're in the South, we're in the Bible Belt, and it just grew just extraordinarily, to a point where it's on Sundays the average attendance would be over 2,000. They kept outgrowing buildings and finally landed on this beautiful piece of property close to Love Field Airport. And the campus is beautiful and stunning and has architectural buildings that are of significance. But so I've always watched this congregation, and I'd been pastoring in the Bournemouth congregation for 13 years, and then was called to serve the founding congregation of the Metropolitan Community Churches, where I served for another 13 years. And as I was coming to the end of my tenure there, I became aware that the cathedral was going to be searching for a new pastor. And I was just like, oh my God, wouldn't that just be like the dream job, the dream call? And so I put my name in the hat, and after a year search and interviews and process, I'm assuming I wasn't the only person looking for that job. I was duly called to that congregation. We're about a 4,000 member congregation, now average about 12 to 1,300 on Sundays, pre-COVID-19, and doing a tremendous amount of benevolence work in the DFW area. Founded a number of organizations. In fact, the joke is that if there's an organization in Dallas that has hope in it, you can probably be assured it came out of Cathedral of Hope at some point. And so a pretty well-respected congregation, a progressive congregation, obviously. But now as a member of the United Church of Christ, really is a beacon for that denomination, but is really about helping folks to not only discover, but to reclaim their Christianity. And not just LGBTQ people, but folks who have been estranged from their own congregations, or who have a different understanding of what it means to be Christian, away from this kind of dominant culture that we exist in, where I would say Christianity has been hijacked by the religious right, which I say are neither right or religious. But have been hijacked in such a way that there are so many barriers to so many different kinds of people that are trying to find their way to understand who God is and what Christianity really means. So our mission is to proclaim Christ through faith, hope, and love, and to to really echo that and mirror that in our lives as people of faith, whether you call yourself Christian or not. And that gives us that progressive edge of really reclaiming the sense of sacred, that each person is sacred. And we would take very seriously the words of the Apostle Paul that said, there is nothing that can separate you from the love of God. Nothing. No thing, no person, no church, no belief, nothing can separate you.
Yeah, that leads...
It's an incredible place.
Yeah, that leads me into my next question. Before I get there, I wanted to highlight, my mom is actually on the call today, and she said, Reverend Neil, it's wonderful to see you here. My first visit with you was a large LGBT educational event put on by Sharon Fine, who I was talking to you about earlier in Dallas. I learned a lot listening to you speak that day, and I'm delighted you're spending the morning with our Natasha, so me. But yeah, what you were sharing is a great segue into my next question, which is, how has the rise of religious freedoms become a code word and ableist for discrimination?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this a little bit earlier. I'm writing a book with a rabbi friend of mine right now, and we're talking about how some of these things overlap. There was a time in history, not too long ago, where churches would start to use the phrase "all welcome," and the word "all welcome" signified that LGBT people were welcome. They weren't yet to the place where they could say it out loud, but it was kind of code that if you put up "all welcome," that really meant that they were reaching or trying to let LGBT people know, because so many LGBT people have been excluded from churches because of sexual orientation. In a similar way, using pronouns after our names now, which I think is an important move, is in some ways code for trans folk and non-binary folk and genderqueer folk, to understand that the leadership or the person that they're talking to has an idea about gender and gender identity, and that those are important. In the same way that we use Black Lives Matter, is a way of helping to bridge, to understand that there are some cultural pieces that are important, their values. So that's the positive. And then you get the negative. And religious freedom is one of those, I think, right at this very moment, is code for, in some ways, white evangelical conservative Christianity. And we hear over and over again this, it's deeply held religious beliefs as code for what is not politically correct now to say I have a bias, or I'm racist, or I'm a white supremacist, or whatever it is. And people are using this language to be able to discriminate without facing the consequences of discrimination. And we're seeing that move through legislation. We need to understand that most of our legislatives come from white men, let's be honest, and have a desire to keep white people in power. And so this white conservative evangelical Christianity is a big proponent of this code word, religious freedoms. And basically what that means is that, if you're a woman and you're seeking medical care for an abortion, or for just general health care, a person can say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to treat you because of my deeply held religious beliefs, and I have religious freedoms to deny that care to you. We're seeing that specifically with trans folk who are needing medical care, and people are saying, it's my religious freedom not to treat you. And these are code words that are being placed into the general populace, and using the separation of church and state, or the religious freedom in our constitution, to justify it and to strengthen it, and therefore to embolden it. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous to start to put these into everyday use, because I can go anywhere and use this phrase and no one can challenge me, because who can tell me what my deeply held religious beliefs are? It's my deeply held religious belief that same gender folks should be able to marry. But the church has, the establishment, the church has used deeply held religious beliefs to deny LGBT people the freedom to marry. And so it becomes ridiculous, and it becomes a societal problem when we start to endorse these and use them in our legislation in a country where we have church and state separate. And note I said church and state, which is another indicator of where we're at. First of all, we're not a Christian country, but we don't say temple and state separate. We say church and state, which signifies that realistically the end game is to make America a Christian country. And I really believe that. I really believe that's where we're heading with all of this, white evangelical conservative Christianity. So I use this example over and over again for folks about how dangerous this can become. And it sounds ridiculous, but I don't think it is. I think that we're not far from some of this reality. So I'm in, I won't mention the name of a store because I'm not allowed to promote, but I'm in a grocery store. I've done my grocery shopping, and I get to the checkout, and I take my bacon out of my basket, and I place it on the conveyor belt, and the person who's ringing me up, I don't know if that's an English phrase or an American one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But who's checking me out says, "Oh, I'm awfully sorry. I can't sell you that bacon because my deeply religious beliefs say that you can't eat pork. But if you can get all these other things, but once you've checked all these things out, then you need to take the bacon and go to cashier number one, because they don't have the same deeply held religious beliefs as I do, and you can get your bacon there." And it sounds ridiculous, and hopefully we'll never get to that place. But because the person has said deeply held religious beliefs, that is almost a code for my own bias, my own discrimination being layered on somebody else. Not because I can't sell you bacon, but because I have a deeply held religious belief. And that might be fine if you're in a store where you don't sell bacon, but in a place, in a free market, the cake baker, all of those free marketplaces, this becomes potentially very dangerous. And as I say, with hospitals, we already know that some of this is already happening, especially with transgender folk and women who are seeking basic health care, being denied it because of their ability now to use this coded language.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that supermarket example. I do realize, it's silly in a way, but it brings home that point that if we're selling bacon in the market, we can't say, no, you can't have it. And so I appreciate that example. And you were mentioning specifically, same-sex couples. In what ways has being an out gay man yourself helped many in your own congregation come to terms with their identity and their faith?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that all of us have the potential to open the door to spirituality just because we live it out loud. So, I was sharing with a colleague the other day about my first experience in a gay pride parade in London. And I was there in my clerics, and I was in the parade and walking through the streets of London with some church folk. And I got to the end of the parade, and somebody sought me out and came up to me, and he said, is this for real, or is this a costume? Because didn't expect to see a minister walking in the pride parade. And I said, "Oh no, this is for real." And we got into a conversation. He said, "I just want you to know that just being here today has given me some kind of permission that I can explore my Christianity that I'd rejected because of what the church did to me." And I think just being visible in the world, as an out gay man, as a parent, as somebody who holds position in a now a pretty influential church, in a part of the United States that is still considered very conservative, gives people time to ponder and time to question. So if he can be, then can I be? If he has been able to reconcile these pieces of his life, and not be ashamed of them, not hide them, not get exposed for them, not pretend that they're not part of who he is. If he's able to do that, then how can I begin that journey as well? And I think that's all we can do. We can be conduits to kind of open the door to the possibility of being able to reconcile these fundamental pieces of who we are. We don't separate them out. They are integrated, and the Christian gospel would talk so much about wholeness, and wholeness means putting these pieces together. They're not separating them out. When I walk into church on Sunday morning, I'm the same person that was perhaps in the bar on Friday night. They're not different pieces of me. They are whole. They are integrated into my life. And I think that is just so important in a world where we see people compartmentalize their lives all the time. And that's not to say that I don't have a private life. I always tell people I definitely have a private. I don't have a secret life, but I have a private life, which is for me and my family. But I don't have a secret life, and I think that's really important for me to keep that authenticity, to open the door for others to explore the potential, the possibility that this God thing that we talk about is real, and can make a difference in people's lives. And I think you do that in so many ways yourself. As people look at you, as a young successful woman, and see the potential that if she can do it, so can I. And we become those conduits. We become those places of touchstones, if you will, that people see the possibility and potential for themselves.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. I'd love to hear what your experience with the intersectionality of faith, color, gender identity, and sexual orientation, what your experience has been like.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. I came out of the Mormon tradition, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I did not leave the church because I was gay. I left the church for my family left the church before I was even old enough to really consider what it meant to be a member of the church at that point. But I have to say I have to confront some realities of the church today, and the realities of the church today as an institution is that it's patriarchal, it's misogynist, it's racist. It does not deal with intersectionality very well. It is in some ways it is an institution that says you fit this box, and if you fit this box, you're going to go to heaven, and if you don't fit this box, I don't know where you're going. And that's become part of our dominant culture. It's become part of our dominant narrative around Christianity. But that is not the story. That's the story we've created. The story, if we really go back to Scripture, the story of Scripture is one of always being on the side of the marginalized, the oppressed. Every time Jesus walks into a room, he is criticized by those who fit the box, and steps out of that box to find the woman at the well, or the blind Bartimaeus, or the one with the legion of spirits, or the woman who crawls through the crowd to touch the hem of his garment, and Jesus says, who touched me, and finally finds the woman who touched him, and your faith has made you well. Every story we find of Jesus feeding the 5,000, lifting up women, finding the fisher folk who are on the outside, every story we encounter with Jesus is about the marginalized, the oppressed, and brings about that start of intersectionality, of bringing about that real need for authenticity. And when I talk about reclaiming Christianity, from the patriarchy, the misogyny, the racism, all of those things, I really am talking about reinforcing what the founder of Christianity, if we label that with Jesus, was really on about, and that we should spend far more time telling people why they're welcome, rather than telling them why they're not welcome. And what a shift in the narrative that would be if we could just spend more time telling people why they're welcome and how they're welcome. Not that they have to then change to fit the box, but that their intersectionality, their reality is what builds the kingdom of God, not destroys it. And in some ways, Natasha, I've moved on from using the word intersectionality to using the word layering, because I'm a white cisgender male gay guy, and those are layers of who I am, and I certainly have my areas of oppression that I've had to live through, but a black gay cisgender male has another layer of oppression, and so I can't lump myself with just gay. I have to see and have to explore and have to be impacted, not just by the intersectionality, but by the layering of oppression. And then if you add a woman, or if you do ableist language, and all the things that just complicate what this dominant Christianity in our country has made inaccessible to so many folks who have these layers of oppression. And I think the job of the church and the job of those of us who call ourselves clergy is to really fulfill that great commission of Jesus, and that is, just to open the doors and welcome you in. And let, my job isn't to tell people how to live or what to believe. My job is to open the door and let what we would call the Spirit of God do whatever the Spirit of God is going to do. And I think that adds excitement to worship. I think it adds excitement to the world. I think it adds a dimension to the world that I think is part of this new realm that we talk about, this new realm of God, this understanding of making earth more like heaven. And I don't know about you, but people tell me all the time that this earth feels like hell. And how sad, that this liberating gospel of Jesus makes people feel like we're living in hell rather than living in heaven. And I see my job as just helping folks find a little taste of heaven that's without judgment, that's without rules and regulations. And that doesn't mean that we don't stop at stop signs, but a sense of freedom that they can explore their spirituality. And for many of us, we use Jesus as the model. For some, we use Muhammad. For some, we use Buddha. For some, we use Krishna. But we should find gateways, open gates to help people navigate this layering that I think we need to expose and help people move through to a place of freedom for all.
And I love thinking about it as you were putting it, as layering as opposed to intersectionality. I hadn't actually heard of it in that light. And in terms of shifting narratives, the telling people why they're welcome as opposed to why they're not welcome, I find that from my own experience with some Southern Baptist church, it's you're not welcome if you are any of these things, as opposed to you're welcome for all of these reasons and we want you here. And so I love that shift in narrative personally.
Yeah, I was recently at a Roman Catholic funeral for a friend of mine. And I was there. I was in clerics, and the priest saw me, and but we got to communion, and he laid out, spent a good 5 minutes telling everybody in the congregation who couldn't come. But at the end, he then said, but you can come forward and receive a blessing, just keep your arms crossed in front of you. And I was like, I can work that through theologically, but as a person sat in that congregation that day, I was like, why would I want to receive a blessing from someone who wasn't willing to give me communion? And I know I was not the only one in that funeral who felt that way. And it was just sad that he had spent all this time telling us why we couldn't come to communion, which quite frankly, when you go back to that ritual that Jesus did, he knew that Judas was going to betray him. He knew that Peter would deny him 3 times. He knew all these things about these people, their humanity, all the layering of their own oppression. But he never once said, "No, sorry, Judas, you can't receive it. Sorry, Peter, you can't have it." He just opened the table and said, "If you want to come and eat, come and eat, and we'll get down to whatever else we need to at some other point." But yeah, it's the institution of religion versus Christianity, and I try to draw those. Because I believe that all of us need some kind of spirituality in our lives, whatever that means, whether it's organized or not. I always tell people the Cathedral hopes the most disorganized religion you'll ever meet. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We have a number of people sharing in the chat about, yes, Jesus very much knew, and Jesus still sat with his flawed friends. And so I have a few more questions that I want to get to, and we've had a number come through. If anyone else has questions for Neil today, make sure to drop those in the chat before we get to the Q&A from you all. But I'm wondering if you could talk to us about queer theology and the theology of radical inclusion.
Yeah, so I did my doctorate of ministry out of San Francisco Theological Seminary, which is in the Bay Area in Marin County, and it was a great experience for me. And I wanted to do my doctoral thesis on queer theology because, and I want to really frame this for us, because I don't use the word queer as a derogatory term. I broadened the definition. In fact, I think it's the original definition of queer, which is odd, different, subversive, not necessarily just lesbian and gay or bisexual or transgender, but queer in the sense that we want to stand against dominant culture. So in our dominant culture, women who go out to work could be seen as queer because they're going against the dominant culture, which says that women should stay at home and take care of the kids and do laundry. Those sorts of those are the moments of queerness. Being a gay dad and adopting a baby is queer. It stands against that dominant culture. And so I wanted to see where queer theology intersects with the Christian narrative. And over and over and over again, I saw Jesus confronting the dominant culture with a new narrative, with a new understanding. You have heard this, I tell you that. The Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the earth. Not the Pharisees, not those who think that they've got their religion all nicely tied up. And so, I talked about queer theory, which is the theory of how queer became part of the gay liberation movement. But realistically, the queer theology is about any theology that stands against dominant culture. So feminist theology, black theology, gay theology, all of these have given rise to potential of changing the narrative of the dominant culture and reclaiming Christianity. But I also noted that all of those had a particular cause in mind. So in some ways, feminist theology was about breaking down the systems of oppression in marriage and the dowry and all of the things that happen in womanist theology or feminist theology. Black theology was about really giving rise to the voices of Black people, both in Scripture and in our dominant white culture. And gay theology was really about giving a place at the table for LGBT people. And so what I did was I shaped my thesis about showing how in some ways these specialist liberation theology all contributed to the narrative, but they didn't actually change it fully or as well as we could have expected or hoped for. And then also then understood that the word queer is extremely problematic. Even in the LGBT community, queer is still a complicated word. And so I ended my thesis by saying that actually, what would be a better thing than always talking about queer theology would be to actually explore what it really means to have a theology of radical inclusion. And I challenged somebody who might take up the mantle later on, and who knows, I might write something about it myself, but to actually think about what does it mean to be radically inclusive, and where in the church or in faith or in religion per se do we become gatekeepers rather than gate openers, and how do we begin to really think about a gospel of radical inclusion that I think Jesus modeled himself to the point that he hung on a cross, and what does it really mean for us to stop being the gatekeepers of religion that keep so many people out? And I think this radical inclusion challenges all of us, because we all have our biases, we all have our places in us that something rubs us the wrong way. And how do we move past that, understanding that certainly the Christian gospel, the Christian faith, is one that is personal. It is one that is shaped by our own encounter with the divine, and it's not through a prescripted theology. And that's a great challenge, because we like to be sheep, and we like to follow the trend, and we like to follow somebody who we think has it all sewn up. But the Christian gospel is about challenging us to find the divine within us, and then to have that relationship with the divine. And then we come together on Sundays, if you're in church, for encouragement and for empowerment to go back out into the world and to continue to live what we say we believe. And so I think that this understanding of where queer theology has landed, and then thinking about that next step of a gospel of radical inclusion, really challenges the church. And I'm not sure the church is ready for it, even though the church, quite frankly, in the United States and in many places around the world, is in decline, and in some places is dying. And we have to be held responsible for that, because there is no reason why the church should be dying. The church is dying because it's irrelevant, and it's excluded, and has forgotten its mission of the tenets of the Sermon of the Mount, and what we've been called to be and what we've been called to look like. And hear me very clearly. Cathedral of Hope is not a perfect church. But I do believe that we are trying to put into practice what it is that we hope church could look like. But we're full of people just like everywhere else. So does that help?
Yeah, thank you for diving into that. And you mentioned a little bit in the middle about marriage, and I'd love to dive in a little bit there. About there's a misperception that marriage equality here in the States kind of fixed everything and was the benchmark for LGBTQ inclusion. Could you share with our audience why this, in fact, was not the benchmark for inclusion?
Yeah. Well, it was not the benchmark for inclusion. It was certainly a big step towards. And grateful. I was very involved in the marriage equality movement here in the United States, and when I was in Los Angeles, did a tremendous amount of work fighting Prop 8, which did ban marriage for lesbian and gay people specifically. But it certainly was a step forward. But here we are, we call ourselves the United States, but we're not really. Each state is able to determine its own way in which we live into those laws and regulations. So for instance, I'm in Texas, and I could marry a couple on Friday. They could post a picture of their wedding on Facebook on Friday afternoon. They could get to work on Monday morning and be fired, lose their job because they are openly gay or lesbian. And on Tuesday, they could lose their apartment that they rent because the landlord can evict based on their own bias and discrimination. So it did not fix it. It depends on which part of the country you live in and what your local state rules are. But it didn't fix it. The Equality Act, which is now going through the House and the Senate, will fix most things. And I know that there's a lot of folks, including religious folks, who are working on the Equality Act to ensure that gets its passing. And President Biden has assured us and assured us again in his 100-day speech that is a priority for him. And it really does correct all of these things in which LGBT people specifically are discriminated against. And it also picks up the mantle for folks that were left behind in the marriage equality fight. And that's, of course, our transgender siblings. They were certainly part of our spaghetti alphabet soup, LGBTQIA, twin-spirited, same-gender loving. There's so many letters that we add to our alphabet. But they were certainly one specific group that unfortunately were left behind, and I believe wrongly, but they were left behind in our desire to get marriage equality, thinking it would fix everything. But it didn't, and it's sad. And our transgender siblings have been, pretty patient with us, but it's now their turn. We are losing too many, specifically transgender women of color, to senseless murder. 16 already this year here in the United States. And we lift their names, and I do this work, especially the Equality Act work, and much of my religious work, remembering their names and lifting up their names, as well as my work around police reform, to work with our Black and brown folk who are continually discriminated and murdered for doing things that as a white man I could do and not have to worry. And so you got me on the political social justice piece now, which is just as congruent with my faith. I do this work because of my faith, not in spite of it. I believe my faith calls me to this work, and to stand, as I said before, on marginalized. One thing I didn't say earlier, and I just want to say this, is I think the role of the church is is not to collude with culture, but to drag culture to the margins, because I think on the margins is where life really happens, and we live in a false reality, compartmentalize, just to be in the middle, and that's not where life really is.
Well, I want to just say thank you for amplifying the murder and the loss of those trans folk who have been taken, and doing this work for all of those marginalized. And I appreciate all the work that you're doing. We have gotten a number of questions from our community here, and I'd love to switch over to those to be able to get through hopefully at least a few of them. I want to go ahead and start with one we have from Vicky that has a lot of great information in it. She said, thanks so much, Reverend Thomas, for your journey and inspiration. As a practicing, in parentheses, supermarket Catholic, meaning I use my own conscience for what I agree with and what I abide by, I was incredibly disappointed with Pope Francis's overt message last month that a priest cannot bless same-sex marriages. As a proponent for progressive change in the Roman Catholic Church, I was happy with the direction that Pope seemed willing to take to the Church. Clearly, the RC Church is at its heart a paternalistic organization. I feel like he caved to that pressure. Do you advise we continue to push for reform within our own religious, quote-unquote, wheelhouses, owning our own beliefs and pushing progress where we can, or abandon the imperfect structures and only belong to spaces that are fully and openly welcoming?
Well, thanks. That's a great question, and I say it's a both and. I don't think one has to abandon our places of connection if they are serving us. If they are doing harm to us, then I think we get out as fast as we can. I think that's even Jesus said, you know, when he sent the disciples out 2 by 2. He said, if you are not welcomed, then shake the dust off your feet and move on. And I think that's good advice. But I do think it's a both and. You know, I grew up in the Mormon church, and although I'm not practicing Mormon at all, I still do work with the Mormon church because I think it's important for me to be in the uncomfortable spaces as well as in the comfortable spaces. But I know where to retreat to when I need my own nurture and when I need my own care. I've got friends who are openly gay and they're in the Roman Catholic Church, and they're appalled by the remarks a couple of months ago, and they asked me what should we do, and I said, well, you know, I think if the Roman Catholic Church and its liturgy and its worship feeds you, then I'm not going to tell you to stop going. What I can tell you is stop giving money to it, and find ways in which you can pay your tithe to organizations that are working for social change and making the church different. But if you're continuing to fund an oppressive system, then I'm not sure that you're actually doing anything to change it. And so I would really encourage people to think about where they put their money and where they use their resources in order to be the change that you want to see in the world. But I'm not going to tell anyone to stop attending a church. You know, when I was in Bournemouth, England, you know, I sat on the Bournemouth Council of Churches, and as an openly gay man in a congregation that did holy unions at that point for same gender folks, they would not give me voice or vote. When I left Bournemouth, England, 13 years later, not only was I now a full member, or our church was now a full member of the Bournemouth Council of Churches, but I was also the secretary. And I think that's because I engaged, I stayed, I didn't support their decisions, but I stayed faithfully at the table because it was important for not just for me, but for the people who came after me, that they would also have a place at that table. So I think it's a both and. I don't think it's an either or, unless it's abusive. If it's abusive, I wouldn't stick in an abusive relationship, yet alone an abusive church.
Well, while you were talking about Bournemouth and the UK, I have one more question that I wanted to ask because I am curious. I believe you were honored with an award by Queen Elizabeth II at Buckingham Palace, which is just a wild statement. Would you mind sharing more about what the award was and what it was for?
Yeah, so Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, God bless her, and happy 95th birthday, I think it was just last week. And of course, condolences on the passing of her husband. But yes, the Queen has, I think it's 3 garden parties every year. And folks are selected to attend those garden parties. And the way the selection works in the UK is that you have to be nominated by the community, and then usually the high sheriffs or the mayors vet you and then forward your name to Buckingham Palace as somebody who's going to be honored. And it's usually for specific work that you've done. I was very involved in the AIDS pandemic in the UK, and built hospices for folks who were dying. I'd also opened one of the first night shelters in our city, and had worked with City Council on many initiatives that continue the work that I still do today. I was nominated by the community and the High Sheriff of Dorset, passed my name to Buckingham Palace, and lo and behold, I got an invite in the mail to the garden party, which I went to with my partner at the time. Had a great time. It was an honor. What I later found out was that they're also the garden parties are also the beginnings of usually titles for people in this. We're in the UK, we have lords and ladies and all sorts of titles, OBEs and MBEs and all sorts of stuff. And I found out later that that was the first step in possibly getting a title. But as I'm now in the States, that's off the table now. So, but it's it's a fun fact.
Yeah.
That I did get to go to Buckingham Palace and meet Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah, super exciting. And I felt crazy asking that question. So cool. We do have a question from Christina asking, do you ever engage in LGBTQ plus in faith work with Black Protestant clergy? If so, can you share about the experience and how it allowed for that additional conversation of intersectionality or layering, as you were talking about?
Yep. Yes, I do. I do work with Black Protestant clergy here in Dallas and in Los Angeles. It's a different experience in the two different places, but I'm committed to that work. I happen to be one of the folks who believe that in the world today, it is incumbent on white clergy to do some of the heavy lifting around racism and around white supremacy. It's not up to Black people to heal our racism. That is work we have to do as white people. And it's important that we are at the table, shoulder to shoulder, side by side. I do believe that in some ways the Black church was bought by white supremacy. And by that, what I mean is that some of the faith-based initiative money that was around in the Reagan years was handed to raise the status of Black churches to continue white supremacy, and I think we're suffering some of those consequences today. One of my great mentors here in Dallas often talks about how money from that era gave a position and platform to Black clergy that would never have been offered in the past, but it came with a price, and the price was silence around racism, silence about food insecurity, silence about the oppression of Black people in the United States of America. And I think we're on a tipping point. I think we're shifting that narrative, and I think we're reclaiming the history, the true history of the United States, the true history of my country. Sending slave workers to be to the United States, and our imperialism and nationalism, our classism, all of those isms that have kept this separation between white and Black and brown folk. And I'm looking forward to some of that work of standing shoulder to shoulder with Black Protestant clergy as they do their own reclaiming of narrative, and as we do some of the work of the ways in which, as white folk, we have supported that oppression, and we find ways in which we can repent from that. And in Dallas, I know, Natasha, you know Dallas pretty well. But there is definitely a north-south divide here, and all the money usually goes to North Dallas, and very little money goes to South Dallas. And in fact, when I first came to Dallas, I looked at the maps and how road systems were built and how trains were built, and layered these maps on top of each other, redlining, and you can see very, very clearly that the way in which this city was built, and many other cities in the United States, was to keep black and brown people poor and white people rich. And that's a generalization, but that is also very true. And we need to do the heavy work, the heavy lifting work of moving that around, meeting with city council members and redistributing funds, working with the police on redistribution of the way in which they spend the funds that are given to the police, on mental health issues as well as on policing, of bias training, and all the work that needs to be done. We're in this for the long haul, but I think we are on a tipping point that I think in some ways was a little tangible with the recent conviction of the police officer, the ex-police officer that was convicted for the murder of George Floyd. So I think that we're as we would probably say, we're waking up to our realities. But as we wake up, we can't just be awake. We now have to do something about it. And I'm honored to work with some of my Black Protestant clergy here in Dallas to do some of that work.
So we have a couple of questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but let's see if we can get to them. We have one from Mark to ask, how do you deal with the shame that stems from the contradicting messages we receive from the religious community?
Can you just say that one more time, Natasha?
How do you deal with the shame that stems from the contradicting messages we receive from the religious community?
Well, it's a tough one because there is so much shame and guilt that has been layered on so many of us for so many things we've done in our lives. I'm surprised that the church is even relevant today. But grateful it is. I believe that is only by the grace of God that we still exist. So one of the things I didn't talk about, I'll try to keep this very brief, but one of the things I didn't talk about was I do a lot of work in the 12-step community. And when I was in England, I worked with 5 drug and alcohol rehab houses, working specifically on this topic around shame and guilt, because that's a driving force in masking hurt and pain through alcohol and drugs. And so I talked with and continue to talk about that we don't have to subscribe to this God that the church portrays, and that we have the power to actually define who God is for ourselves. And if we reclaim that sense of sacred and divine within us, then the God that we get to believe in is a God who doesn't make mistakes, a God who loves us, a God who knows us, a God we can't run away from, and a God who, regardless of what we think we've done wrong in our lives, comes alongside us and loves us. And when you can start to understand that God's love is also love of self, and that when you love self, you love God, and when you accept God's love, you love self, and then from that place you get to love the world. The greatest commandment is to learn to love your neighbor to the same degree that you love yourself. Now, if that's true, then we're actually offering some shitty love out there, because many of us don't love ourselves that well. And I think some of the hard work that we have to do in our spirituality is to love ourselves. And when we love ourselves, every bit of ourselves, stand in front of the mirror naked every morning with all our lumps and bumps and say, "You're looking good, kid. Let's go get them." When we can get to that point, which sometimes you have to faith it till you make it, not fake it, but faith it. Then I believe that self-esteem changes, shame begins to take less hold on our lives, guilt begins to drop, and we begin to navigate the world from a place of love rather than from a place of self-hate, which is what many of us do, myself included at times.
Beautifully put. I love the faith it till you make it. And then the last question is, how has the church had to pivot during the pandemic, and how does it offer outreach during such a disconnected time?
So we have not stopped doing all of our benevolence work throughout this pandemic. We're doing it differently. We're doing it outside. We're still feeding the hungry. I think we produce something like 30,000 meals every year out of the Cathedral for folks who are food insecure, plus all of our counseling services and all the work that we would generally do as a church. We had to pivot, obviously, like everybody else, had to go online. We thankfully had a robust small group ministry that meant that people could connect and still do spirituality together. And then all of our worship services were online until 4 weeks ago when we started in-person worship again. And now we've been doing that with all of the CDC regulations, you know, the masks and social distancing and all the things that we need to do and a limited capacity. So we're pivoting backwards and forwards. It feels like it says here every day we're pivoting to something else. But we are grateful that we have not had to stop doing what we do. We have a day school for children, 6 weeks to 5 years. We've fully operated that throughout the pandemic. We've just been very lucky about being able to pivot in such a way that we've been able to do the work safely and to keep people as safe as possible. Nothing is guaranteed. But as safely as possible.
Yeah, well, we are at time. Thank you for getting to that question so quickly. I want to thank you so much, Neil, for your time today and all that you shared, and for everyone here in the community that joined in and brought such wonderful questions. Again, we hope to see you next week, same time, but different place. It'll be via Zoom. And until then, thank you so much, Neil. Are there any last words you'd like to impart upon us before we end today?
Just know how blessed you are, regardless of your circumstances of life, and just be the very best you can be.
Wonderful, wonderful way to end. Well, thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. We will see you next week.